So thank you so much for being here. I
Absolutely.
especially if you are in the middle of traveling and doing all these crazy things, I'm so grateful for you taking the time out to talk with us.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for letting me be a part of this.
We have been talking about your book for the last hour, and we had so much to talk about. Um, this is one of those books that lends itself really perfectly for discussion, I think. Um, because there's really a lot to contemplate. Um, there are the sort of the obvious issues with, these are human beings and there's all of this stuff going on in the world. And this is really, I mean, it's allegorical, but it's very true to what's happening in the world. Um, there's a lot to talk about. I would love to know where this came from, where, where did was there something specific that brought you to write this book, or um where I would love to know its origin.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one of the fun things you get to do when you're an author is come up with a very clean Genesis story after the fact. This happened, I wrote a book. Um, the closest thing I have to a sort of instigating moment or instigating event was in 2012. I was back in Egypt. I was born in Egypt. My family is all Egyptian, but I left when I was 5. My father got out of the country and we followed him. But I was back there in 2012 as a journalist. I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and I was riding around town with an old high school buddy of mine, another guy who got out and then came back, sort of thing. My buddy Michael, and he was, we're just shooting the shit, and he's complaining about the most universal thing in the world. He's complaining about rent. The rent's too high. The rent's too high. And at one point, I asked him, "Okay, so what's the rent in your apartment, for example?" And he says, "Well, do you mean the locals' price or do you mean the Syrians' price?" I said, "Well, what the hell's the Syrians' price? What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, we've had this influx of people show up recently, and them you can charge 3 times as much. I mean, they have no choice. What are they going to do? Go somewhere else?" And it was clear that this wasn't just a rent thing. This was, you go down to get fruits and vegetables from the stall down the street. They hear your accent. They put 2 and 2 together. They immediately gouge you because what are you going to do? And it wasn't just sort of millionaire property developers doing this. It was, again, the guy who's making like, $10 a day selling fruits and vegetables. And just the casualness of that cruelty. And this isn't like, a people coming from the other side of the planet. Egypt and Syria were one country at a certain point. And yet it was just, there was a population that was vulnerable enough to be exploited. And so they were going to be exploited. And I was thinking about that, and I didn't, I retreat into fiction when I have questions for which I have no answers. That's when the journalist in me fails, and that was the moment I started thinking about the things that over the next few years would eventually congeal into What Strange Paradise. I ended up putting it together across the duration of that period in 2015 where people seem to give a damn. I'm being a little glib here. What I mean is when the media attention on the Mediterranean crossing was quite intense. And I had sort of started before then and I had worked after then. So I got to see the entire sweep of that temporary giving of a damn, I guess. And the book in large part is written against the idea that it's okay to be temporarily outraged about something and then move on. I think the idea was to try and dwell. I think novels are a good place to dwell. And so generally that was the starting point for what eventually became this book.
That's really interesting. I mean, for one, you bring on that sort of currency of sort of human cruelty as part of so many moments in this book, with the just paying to have a place on the boat, paying to have paying to have the right place on the boat, paying to have a life jacket that's probably not going to do anything to help you. And then just, it's really sad that people don't see the humanity in people who are desperate. But it's funny that you say that you work out, the things that you can't solve in your journalism or things in fiction, because I think fiction is so good at creating empathy. And I think you created very empathetic characters in Amir and in the rest of the people on the boat, maybe with the exception of Muhammad, but I did find him very interesting. So is that something that you sort of strive to do in your writing, is create this sort of empathy for people who are dispossessed or dehumanized? I read American War as well years ago. So
thank you for reading them both. That's two very depressing books. I hope it wasn't back to back.
No, two different book clubs, so I read that. I think when I emailed you, I said, I read American War with another book club and we had a lot to talk about. So I picked this one without reading it first. So
thank you for that. I appreciate it. I've been told that my novels make good book club books because the people who dislike them really hate them. And so they come in with a passion to explain exactly how awful they are. I think about empathy a lot because among writers that I know, it gets a bad rap. A lot of my favorite writers think the notion of trying to write in pursuit of empathy is a bit of a mug's game. And I think that has something to do with the Western conception of empathy, in particular the North American conception of empathy, which is so intertwined with how heavily individualistic a society we live in.
Yeah.
And it bleeds into this notion of like, oh, I need to feel other people's pain, but also if I feel it hard enough, I can fix it. And that sort of individual agency starts cramming itself into a concept that is not that old in the English language. The word empathy comes from the German, I think, Eifelung, which I'm sure I'm completely mispronouncing, but that word literally translated means to feel into. And I think about that a lot because I think of the entire endeavor of literature as an attempt to feel into another. So I do think of it that way. I think one of the issues I had with this book in particular is, I write very political fiction. I think all fiction is political. It's either sort of actively political or passively political. The book is either political because of what you're talking about or because of what you've chosen to ignore. My books are actively political. And in that mode of writing, I think of the job of fiction as intruding on reality. But the problem that I had when I was putting What Strange Paradise together is that I was writing this fable. I was writing this book that was deliberately fantastical and got more fantastical as you went through the after chapters. But the parts of it that felt the least realistic were parts that I cribbed verbatim from real life. So, for example, there's a point in the book where they're watching TV and there's a politician on TV who's saying, if all these refugee women have lost their husbands, why do they keep asking for birth control? And if they're all so poor, why do they have cell phones? And that's all verbatim from Greek politicians. That's all just stuff that I stole. There's a scene in Egypt where Amir and his family are watching TV, and there's a press conference where this general with the Egyptian military is declaring that the Egyptian military has created a device that cures all diseases, and everybody's applauding. And it's the least realistic thing in the entire book. You can go on YouTube and find that press conference. That was a thing that happened. And everybody got up and applauded because that's what you do in a dictatorship. So I went into it with the endeavor of fiction being a tool to intrude on reality. And what I wasn't prepared for was the extent to which reality intrudes on the fictional. And I had a real hard time balancing those two things. And so you get a book that I think when it gets away from me the parts that I want to feel fantastical are more grounded than the parts that I assumed would just be read as the natural state of things because of the kind of world we've allowed to happen. But what am I going to do about that?
It's funny, that's something that a lot of authors talk about in that, like, oh, suddenly I wrote this thing and now this thing is happening and it's informing the way people are reading my book, which is really kind of funny. But I mean, I guess in the realm of seeing the humanity and people who are in really tough spots, seeing something like, oh, why do they have cell phones and why blah blah blah. I mean, I remember reading that part of the book and going, oh yeah, that's real.
Yeah, I mean, there's the life vests being made out of foam. That's a real detail. You can go to or at least this was the case when I was researching the book. I suspect it probably still is the case. You can find the Facebook pages that these smugglers set up, like any other business.
Oh,
And the
wow.
background photo is of a Carnival Cruise Line ship.
Oh my God.
That's the idea they're selling. All of this stuff is the very real racial segregation on the boat, who's going to be down there and most likely to die versus who's up here. Again, all of that's stolen from real life. I subscribe to this thing that Jorge Luis Borges once said about all literature being tricks, and no matter how clever your tricks are, they eventually get discovered. My tricks are not particularly clever. I revert to inversion a lot. I take the thing that's happening over there and I put it over here. And with this one, I was trying to take a comforting fairy tale that Westerners have been telling their kids for a long time, and I wanted to invert it. And so I settled on Peter Pan. And I think of this book as an inverted Peter Pan. And you mentioned that idea of like the moment affecting the book, right? The book is read in the moments it's read, but the nature of publishing being what it is, it's not written in the moment it's read. And with American War, it was a disaster in that front because I finished the first draft in the summer of 2015.
Oh boy.
And 3 weeks later, Donald Trump announced he's running for president. This book about a second civil war comes out 4 months into the Trump administration. And it does wonders for my royalty statement. The book sales are through the roof. But to this day, I get emails from people being like, hey, way to cash in on the Trump, as though I wrote the book on November 9th or something, And I thought I wouldn't have this problem with What Strange Paradise because it's a very, very different book. And then the first 4 people to read the book had 4 entirely different interpretations of what had happened, of what they had just read.
Interesting.
So it's been a very different but a very similar ride in some respects.
Well, if you're okay with us talking about spoilers, are you okay? Okay. And I will make sure that anywhere this video goes, it'll be plastered all over spoilers. Don't watch this if but we were debating a lot of what ultimately happened. And after looking at your epigraphs, it makes a little bit more sense because I finished the book. Wait, what? Were your early readers in that same camp or
yeah, one of them was so I got it's all a fantasy. I got all of the after stuff as a fantasy. I got he died in the initial bombing, and everything from the very beginning is fantasy. He never made it out. I got an email from a reader recently saying, thank you so much for that very hopeful last chapter where the man is moving the necklace out of the way so that he can help his child up. Which, I mean, I hope there's more people like that in the world. That's good for him. I've gotten some interpretations that, to be quite honest, I think are more profound than what I intended. Someone said, this is another child and this is starting all over again because the cycle never ends.
I had wondered that as well.
For me, again, another thing that Borges says, you know, it doesn't matter in the slightest what the writer intended. It matters what I see the book to be. And so it doesn't matter in the slightest what I intended, but what I intended is very closely related to the epigraphs.
Yeah.
If you've read An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, you know, and I wanted to test the reader's tolerance for optimism as a form of self-delusion. And so you're on this island and all the flora and the fauna is made up. There's no such thing as cloudstone. There's no sunhead swifts. And as you move further along the after chapters, the things that are happening are becoming more fantastical, leading up to this moment where, you know, Vanna jumps off the bridge, for example.
Right.
And then when Colonel Kethros starts talking, not only in Arabic, but in the particular dialect of the child, and I'm pushing, and then I'm pulling the rug out. You know,
Yeah.
it is, I say this without moral judgment, it's a deeply manipulative book in that respect. But, you know, I've gotten a lot of angry emails about the end, more so than any other facet of
I
this
believe
book.
you probably have. I would not have been among those people because I stopped and I thought about it. And then I thought about it some more, you know, which is why I was so happy that we were discussing it tonight, because I was like, I got to talk to other people about this book. Which is why I'm so happy that I chose it and that I'm able to talk to you. But I had something I wanted to ask you, and of course it just went. Was it, well, let's talk about, like, I want to know more about the Colonel, because it was funny when he started on his whole speech and his perfect accent and all of that. I was like, oh my God, he came here on a boat. And he, you know, that's where my mind went with it. And then of course it all changes. And it was funny because I remember the exact moment I was reading that whole section and I was like, oh, is he finally going to show himself to be like more of a person, like more of a feeling person, and not this like big, bad, evil pursuer? So I think you did a really incredible job of creating his character, because he's really bad, like really, really bad. And it's hard for me as a feeling person to understand how somebody could do what he does and be in such incredible pursuit of somebody who's so clearly in just need of help.
Yeah, he's the character who sticks out the most in my head, who stays with me the most of anyone in that book. You know, when I was a kid, I had this physics teacher in high school who was obsessed with this idea that you should never memorize formulas. You should never memorize the formula for the arc of a ball thrown in the air or whatever like that. You should be able to derive the formulas from basic first principles. Like, I'll give you distance, I'll give you speed, you figure it out. And I think of Kethros as the kind of guy who has memorized the formulas of manhood, but has no idea how to derive these things from basic principles of decency or kindness or anything like that. So in a way, he's a sort of composite of, I don't steal whole people, I steal slivers of people. And he's a composite of the slivers of all of these men that I grew up around, and who taught me what it meant to be a man, which was a teaching that was heavily invested in the idea of a firm handshake and looking people in the eye and standing up straight and all of this stuff that, yeah, fine, great, but what is the tether here between these things we're doing and being a halfway decent human being? And I think for Kethros, he has a very firm belief in the formulas, but has no idea how to derive them. So what's left is this very shallow understanding of the world, very brittle. And anytime it's pierced, all that's holding it up, as is the case with lots of men like this, is violence. And so you get a situation where he sees this girl drowning, he rushes in, he does the very chivalrous thing and pulls her out and resuscitates her, and then smacks her father for not showing enough decorum in the moment. Men like that tend to be obsessed with the idea of capital C civilization and systems and order and rules. And so what offends him is the violation of the systems, I think. The individuals, I don't think he sees as human beings. But the integrity of the system is to him all that's holding this thing together, all that separates us from the barbarians of the gate, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so one of the interesting things about him for me is that, like the other bad guys, so-called bad guys, he's the Captain Hook of my island chapters, Muhammad is the Captain Hook of my boat chapters, so on and so forth. But the bad guys in this story are fairly honest with themselves about who they are, whereas the good guys have to keep lying to themselves just to get through the day because of the kind of world in which they exist. I think he has the added advantage of the systems of power in the world he's in tilting in his favor, which gives him a kind of confidence where he never has to assess why the hell he is the way he is, or how these things about being chivalrous and being a stand-up, look him in the eye kind of guy, connect to actually being a decent human being. For him, I think that tether just doesn't exist.
It's interesting that you put it that way, because I think about the other two soldiers that were in pursuit of the kids and how they don't seem to have that. I mean, it seems like they're trying to do it because they have this duty, but I think ultimately deep down, they probably realize that their pursuit and the work that they're doing and all of this is just kind of wrong, and that it's hurting people. Like they didn't really get the dehumanizing memo quite as strongly,
No, there's the very oblique reference to Kethros having had his foot blown off by stepping on a landmine while he was peacekeeping, and not the act of peacekeeping being so constrained by the international politics of it that he was not allowed to do anything. And so I think for him, that's the sort of traumatic incident that really frames his belief that if you don't act, you are in effect allowing evil to spread and that sort of thing. Whereas these kids are much earlier in that particular journey. And I think, there's a scene in the book where one of these kids asks him, like, why are we doing this? Why are we chasing this kid around? He's like, you can either ask that question or you can wear the uniform, but you can't do both.
Yeah, I remember that very distinctly.
There's this guy named Bob McDonald who was this amazing war correspondent and foreign correspondent for the CBC up in Canada, whose other claim to fame is that his brother is Norm MacDonald, the comedian.
Oh.
So Bob McDonald once, I was a journalist for a long time, and I was talking to him once. He was talking about his experience. I think it was in the Israeli military. I forget which military. I'm pretty sure it was the Israeli military, where they were training, and there was a scenario where the hypothetical scenario is it's you and your supervising officer, and it's a suicide mission. It's not even a mission. The army's advancing towards you, and the soldier, your superior tells you to engage, and you got to engage. Anyway, at one point during this sort of very standard explanation of how orders work in the military, Bob McDonald turns to his supervisor and says, so my options are to shoot at those folks and definitely die, or to shoot you and get the hell out of here and live. And it was like, and that was the end of my military career.
That's amazing.
It was just not going to work as a sort of mindset. So yeah, I mean, it's part of the necessity of being in the work of bloodshed. That's what it is.
I really appreciated your discussion of how that training like changes somebody's mind, and how you have to sort of turn off that real impulse to not harm others. That stuck with me, because that it makes sense, because every time I see situations like this in the news, which we see all the time, I can't imagine being the kind of person, even though there are so many of them out there who are like, those people shouldn't be helped. They got what they deserve. It doesn't make sense in my head. And if you are a military person that is trained to do what you're told, I mean, I guess I'm at work, so maybe I shouldn't say that it seems like brainwashing, but but it's bleak. It's really bleak. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, I agree. It's I think there's a particular mindset that sees the world as a particular kind of binary, which is to say you're either wearing the boot or you're getting stepped on.
Yeah.
And if you believe in a world where only one of those two situations, you can only be in one of those two camps, you're going to fight like hell to keep wearing the boot.
Yeah.
Because you think that there is no just interpretation of the world in which that isn't the case. And as soon as you give up the boot, now you're getting stepped on.
Yeah.
And I think that is, again, I don't think it's very difficult to gauge my politics, but certainly there is a major political stream in this country that believes very firmly that you wear the boot or else you're getting stepped on. And that's going to lead to, it's already led to a lot of people losing their lives. It's going to lead to a lot more, because it's not like movement of human beings, forced movement of human beings is going to add, it's going to take a turn for anything but the worse over the next few decades.
Right. Yes. But conversely to the bleakness of all of that dehumanizing, I loved the moments of humanity in this book, like the moments that those kids were really fully seen and where people genuinely did try to help them. I think of Nimra and her impossible job and her genuine desire to help and not being given the proper tools in order to be able to do that in ways that are adequate for the people that she's trying to serve. I think of the hotel maid, really going out on a limb to help them. So I'm glad that it wasn't just pursue. Those moments were there.
My work, the novels, particularly American War, but this one to a certain extent, and a lot of my short stories are often classified as dystopian. The word bleak comes up a lot. When American War was translated into the Chinese market, they changed the title from American War to Nobody Survives.
Oh my God, really?
It should give you a sense of how people think of my work. And fine, I get it, absolutely. But I try, for me, there's, first of all, there's something incredibly hopeful about the endeavor of telling a story in the first place that
Right.
It sort of lifts for me the obligation of trying to make it overtly hopeful. You sit down and you write a story, you assume there's someone else on the other side who's going to read it. So you're already assuming a connection, and the act of connection is really all we have. And, I write these stories that are either in a speculative sense or in a realistic sense, dystopian at the macro level, because we have dystopian systems in place. We all live under hyper-capitalism, and we all live with the climate change that we have caused. And what is it? These things are systemic, and they're at the macro level extremely dystopian, but at the micro level, at the individual level, I think these is fairly utopian books. The people in this, some of them are obviously fairly evil human beings, but the central relationships are between people who love each other and who take care of each other and who are trying their best. I don't, everybody I think is looking for a life raft to kind of climb onto in the present moment we're in, because maybe the species might go extinct, or, maybe the earth might become uninhabitable. All these existential, too anxiety inducing to think about sort of hyper object ideas. And you're looking for life rafts. And for me, the life raft is individual connections between human beings, what we do for one another. And on that level, I think of a lot of the stories I write as being utopian. But because they're taking place in these systems that are incredibly bleak, the thing gets cast, I think, as being oriented in the direction of dystopia. Whereas in my head, I'm thinking of them as somebody trying desperately to climb out of the dystopia,
Yeah.
and maybe not succeeding. I don't know.
No, and that makes complete sense, because I don't, honestly, what I meant by bleak is I don't think of the book itself as particularly as essentially bleak. There is bleakness in the situation that these people are in, and to extrapolate that out into the real world, it's a tough thing to ruminate over, and how can this possibly be fixed, and how can these people be safe, and how do we fix the world?
Yeah.
But I think you're right. When you do zoom in, I really enjoyed the moments among the people on the boat. And, how the pregnant woman, Ibrahim, was that her name? I'm sorry for my blanking on that. Just her constant desire to give, or not desire to give, but her willingness to give, and her willingness to protect Amir, and her kindness to him, was really something to see, particularly when we know from page 1 that this boat sinks, and she's just desperate to be helped, but even in potentially a more precarious situation than many others on that boat, about, having to give birth and all, she's very generous in how she interacts with others. I liked some of the bickering, because that seemed so real to me,
Yeah, the boat chapters are where I lived a lot of the time when I was writing this thing, because again, snippets of people I grew up with, back home. The reason the dialogue is somewhat clunky throughout is because it was happening in Arabic in my head, and I was translating it onto the page in English. And so, you got these people calling each other brother all the time. That's a thing you do in Arabic, yahi this, yahi that. And this is one of those things that happens, like there's always just incredible wrong turns when you're writing a novel. And with this one, at a certain point, I thought, what would be a great idea is if I intersperse between the chapters these monologues from each of the central characters on the boat, explaining how they ended up there. And so for 3 months, I sat and wrote all of these things, 30,000 words, and finished them all, and had an incredible sense of like who these people were. So for example, Ibrahim at one point, makes it clear in her monologue that she's escaping her husband, who is this very pious, very well-respected man, who by day goes into the state security agency and tortures people. That's his job.
Oh my God.
And then you find out later on that one of the other guys on the boat has escaped from this guy. He was in prison being tortured, and these two people will never know this. And so I had this spider web that was building, and I put it into the text, and I was like, oh, this doesn't work at all. Like, it just destroys the flow of the book. And so I got to spend a lot more time with them that didn't end up making it into the novel. But they're effectively at the collision point in which the novel takes place. Like for me, the novel is the collision of two dueling fantasies. There's the fantasy pointed from the west towards the part of the world I come from, which says all these people are barbarians of the gate, and we have to keep them out no matter what. Even if we wreck our own society in the process, we have to keep them out. And then there's the fantasy pointed in the other direction that says, if I can just make it over there, everything will be okay. And certainly I was a very strong believer in that. And I ended up here, and a lot of things were okay, and a lot of things absolutely weren't. But these people now have been launched into the collision point. And these fantasies are so overwhelming that what reality actually is doesn't matter. It's sort of subservient to what the fantasy is. And they have to live with that. And the only person who's providing any kind of anchor is maybe the worst person on the boat, is Muhammad, who's done this enough times that he can say, like, look, you're not ending up in America and hanging out with Brad Pitt at McDonald's. That's not going to happen. That's not how this works. But a lot of the things they're saying are arguments that I heard played over and over as a kid, going back as an adult. The same conceptions about what there is and the privilege of assuming it to be whatever the hell you want until the moment you show up and you have to meet reality. So they're in that strange limbo between just before they have to contend with what it actually is.
It's almost to me like the sort of monolithic concept of the West is almost its own sort of mythological creature or character in this book, because I mean, of course, I'm reading it from a Western perspective. And, some of those ideas, the eating McDonald's with Brad Pitt is a hilarious, unrealistic concept to me as somebody who lives here. But I can understand how that hope exists, and how and I feel like sort of the West or the United States or whatever has always been sort of sold on that mythology.
Yeah, I mean, it's from my experience anyway, when you're thinking about the West, and I mean in Arabic, in certain dialects of Arabic, the word for foreigner and the word for Westerner is the same word. Stranger, someone who's not from here, also a Westerner, kind of thing. The conception of what that place is begins as a negative space. What is the West? I'll tell you what the West is. It's not this.
Right.
It's not whatever the hell is happening here. It's not that. And that's all I need. That is the driving force. A lot of my relatives ended up in this part of the world. And they fled. They got the hell out, either because they couldn't find jobs or because they were going to end up in a secret prison somewhere and nobody was ever going to hear from them again. Whatever the reason, it was a movement away from, long before it was a movement to something.
Yeah.
The shading in of the arrival necessarily happens after the fact. Even for someone like me who grew up, from the age of 5, I've been going to British and American schools. I grew up on Western culture. And even I wake up every morning. I've been living in the US now for the better part of a decade. And I wake up every morning and realize I don't understand this country in the slightest. When I was growing up in Qatar, in the Middle East, and I would watch Rambo and I would watch the action movies of the 80s and 90s, I thought I knew this country down. I thought I knew exactly what it was. But really what I was thinking about is, look at how much of the bullshit that I have to deal with here, I probably wouldn't have to deal with there. So it begins as a negation, and you only find the active side of it much, much later on.
Yeah. I feel like there's always sort of a fantasy in migration, regardless of where it's from or to, of, better things, if only. I've certainly talked to some people here who talk about it that way.
Yeah. I'm not one of those people who's like everywhere is equally bad. I
No,
live here for a
definitely not.
reason. I remember one time when we were living in the Middle East, and then my cousins, when they were very young, their parents moved to Sweden. And so they effectively grew up Swedish. They speak Swedish, they know the culture, that's their home. And many, many years later, a quarter century later, I went to visit for the first time. And I'm walking around, we're in Malmo, in the southern edge of the country, and we're walking around. Sweden has some of the least cruel refugee policies of any European country. Sweden and Germany are fairly high up on that list. And we're walking around, and this BMW comes screaming by with the windows open, and some dude's blasting Arabic music. And my cousin, who's showing me around, stops, looks at the car, and says, "Ugh, goddamn Arabs." And I was like, "Oh, this is how I know we've made it. You've moved up on a ladder, and now you're looking down on somebody and acting the way that I specifically hope never." That's part of it, is that it's presented as a kind of hierarchy. And how do you know that you've sort of acclimated, marinated sufficiently, whatever, become part of the fabric? Is you can look at somebody else and say they're not. And that, I don't think, was confined to Sweden. I've seen that in pretty well every place I've ever been.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. I loved I'm jumping around a little. I loved all the explorations of the idea of home in this book. Because I feel like in people who have been displaced for whatever reason, home is sort of a complicated concept. And does Amir have a home? Do these people have a home? Like what does that concept of home look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the closest I can come to answering it has to do with, again, I talked about stealing slivers of people.
Yeah.
I generally don't take from myself unless it's some failing, some personal failing. If it's cowardice, somebody who knows what the right thing is, but knows what the easy thing is and opts for the easy thing. That's a little bit of me and all of that. The only place outside of that, it's not, I think, a personal failing, where my characters, particularly my central characters, have something in common with me. It's a sense of being unanchored, of not being able to point to a particular place or set of stories or culture and say, this is mine. And that's a result of the kind of life I've had. I was born in one place, but I had to leave when I was 5. I grew up in another place, but I can never really go back because in Qatar, you can't become a citizen. They want to protect the oil and gas money, and it's never going to be home.
Oh, wow.
Canada's home, but I didn't get there until I was 16. And so there's a real formative period to which Canada does not apply. The US is now home, but it's this place I thought I knew, and now I realize I don't know it at all. So the end result is that I've had to come up with a conception of home that has almost nothing to do with geography. Home for me is exclusively a function of memory and relationship. So the place where I had my first kiss as a teenager in Qatar does not exist anymore. That compound has been razed. It's now like a Four Seasons or who knows what the hell it is. But the memory of that is home. The nights we used to drive around in my buddy Donnie's old Daewoo around neighborhoods that do not exist anymore. That's home. Anytime I'm with Donnie now, it's home.
Yeah.
Location, I could go back to Egypt. I could go back to my grandmother's house, which is the earliest building I remember, and feel very little. But the memory of it supersedes the place. And so I think it's that way. Amir is fairly young, and so he's only beginning to develop this idea of thinking of home as memory when he's thinking about his mother and when he's thinking about the place that was. But I think growing into a life, Amir would have become that person for whom home had nothing to do with the nation state. And I think this is one of the reasons that my books are jarring or to some readers, is that a lot of readers have the opposite experience. I was born in a place, I marinated in that place, that is my place. This is unanchored writing. In fact, all of my favorite writers are people who were born and raised in a single place, like Naguib Mahfouz, Toni Morrison, how she wrote about America. She knew America, she knew the place. I just can't do that. I'll never be able to do that by virtue of the life I've lived. So for me, and I think for the characters in both my novels, home can't be a place. So it has to be something else. Other muscles have to kick in to hold up that particular body.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is that why the locations are not named?
Yeah, it's very deliberate that the locations are hyper specific in the before chapter, and they're entirely made up. There's oblique references to at one point somebody says that the island, in the center of the island, is a cave where Zeus and where God himself was born, and that's a reference to Zeus. And if you put all of that together, you find it's Crete. But no, there's no. I made up all of it. One of the things about the kind of upbringing I've had is that I have very little respect for the nation state as a political or geographic entity. So one of the first things I do is I move borders around, and in American War, I drown the Eastern Seaboard, and so on. I give the Southwest to Mexico. I do all of this stuff because, again, I don't really have a patriotic bone in my body. I have nothing against somebody who is. I just didn't have that kind of life. And so, yeah, that's I make it up, and that's another thing that pisses people off, I think.
It didn't piss me off. No, it was just something that we noticed and we're talking about, and we're sort of wondering if it was maybe partially intended to create a universality of the story, because these stories happen a lot. These boats capsizing, these people, like, similar things happen all over the Mediterranean and all over, so we were just kind of curious about the intentionality of that, because it seemed intentional. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's it's not just the frequency of the dead, it's the anonymity.
right.
There is nothing resembling an accurate accounting. People just disappear. And it's not just the crossing. If you are a Black African trying to get out through North Africa, the journey to the water is far more dangerous.
Yeah.
Than the journey across the water is incredibly dangerous. So someone like if you're coming from Eritrea, for example, by the time you make it to the harbor, you've gone through something that's so much worse than the very bad thing that's about to happen. And I mean, where I grew up, the Qatar, this little peninsula sticking out of Saudi Arabia, besides being pound for pound the richest country on earth, is also, at the time I was there, and I suspect it's still the case now, 90% non-Qatari.
Interesting.
90% of the population had come from somewhere else to cash in on the oil and gas money. And so what you have, and my initial conception of the world was very much related to this idea that, yeah, sure, where you come from matters, I suppose, but we're here, and my closest friends are an Indian guy, a Somali guy, and a half Italian, half American dude. And that's just how the world is. Like it's and of course now I live in Portland, which is not that, but it was relevant to my conception of the world, and as a result, I'm not in any way comparing myself to any of these writers. They're far, far better than I ever will be, but it's sort of the anti-Alice Munro. Alice Munro gets Southwestern Ontario and she pins it right the hell down, to the point where my wife, who's from Southwestern Ontario, can't read those books because they're too close to home. And what I'm trying to pin down is kind of the opposite of that. It's the sense of not having that stable ground underneath you. I don't do it well, but it's the only thing I can do, because it's the only set of experiences that, to me, for a long time, constituted the entirety of what it meant to be. So.
No, that I would not say that you don't do it well. I'd say you do it really well. This is a beautifully, beautifully written book, and structurally just very. We were talking earlier about how difficult it is with sort of a dual timeline, and with how it's done a lot and it's not often done well. And this was done very well, in that it's a very tightly woven story. Nothing seemed wasted in any way. I don't know if anybody else has any questions, because I've totally been hogging this conversation. Do any of the rest of you have any questions? No. I would love to ask you if you can talk about it, or if you're willing to talk about it, are you working on anything new?
Yeah, a couple of things. I'm about 5 or 6 chapters into what I hope will be the next novel. It's a sprawling mess. It's very much in the American War vein of, speculative, futuristic. Um, it spans 150 years, multiple families and generations, and goes right up to the end of our species, sort of thing. And I'm sure it's not going to work, but it's so, when you're in the initial stages of something and you don't have to worry about the gears not all fitting together, it just looks like a cool machine when you draw it out. I'm in that stage, so we're still very much honeymooning on that front.
Are you a writer that writes chronologically like that, or is it?
I think all over the place, so I jump in and out of different parts. But once I start writing the first draft, I can't really do it anyway, other than A to B to C to C. That was the case with American War, with What Strange Paradise, and with this thing I'm working on right now. When I'm still thinking about the project, it jumps around, and my notes file has no order whatsoever. But once I start writing, I try from the beginning to the end.
Okay, that's always one of those interesting questions for me to ask authors, because everybody has a different answer to that.
Yeah, someone said recently, a writer said recently, was talking about first drafts, and said that every first draft is perfect because all a first draft has to do is exist. And that's a very comforting thought. I've decided to adopt that because all the novels take forever, and even the short stories take forever. American War was 12 drafts.
Wow.
What Strange Paradise, which is half the length, was 8 drafts.
Wow.
And it's a very different looking book. The only things that didn't change from draft 1 to draft 8 were the opening paragraph and the closing paragraph. Everything else in the middle and the before and after stuff showed up in draft 4. Until then, it was a straight narrative. And draft 4 was when I went before, after.
Wow. Do you ever look back at the previous versions of it and see how different it has become, or is it just all in your head and you lived it and you're done?
I'm trying to get this reading series going where I get writers to read for 5 minutes, and the first 2.5 minutes are the published work, and the next 2.5 minutes are the first draft. Just so writers know, because we have this privilege of walking around like it was born the way it is on the shelf, and it's not that at all. It's a disaster that just you sort of. I every now and then I actually teach a class on sentence structure, and one of the things I do in that class is I show all 8 drafts. And it's just that first paragraph, which thematically did not change at all, but individual words, and I move a comma around or something like that to try and get at what a rewrite looks like. Mm-hmm. Rewriting is incredibly boring, incredibly vital work to the whole project. So every now and then I'll go back, but I'm only now in a place where I can read American War. Enough time has passed. Because they all feel like a eulogy for the person I was when I wrote it, and it's too soon to go to the funeral of the guy who wrote What Strange Paradise. That's not enough time has passed. But American War, I'm starting to read again.
Interesting. I love the idea about putting the early drafts up there.
No one's taken me up on it. I don't think they want to.
I think you should. I'm trying to think of who it was. I want to say it was somebody whose book we just discussed. I want to say it was maybe Jennifer Egan. I'd reach out to her because I think on her website, I haven't actually gone and fully explored it, but I think it was her where she puts all of the previous drafts up, like the first chapter in all of the drafts.
Oh, I got to look that up. It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's who it was.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so
I have teenagers. That would be an incredibly helpful exercise for any kid to see, even just like a paragraph from a few different people. That would be incredible because my kids get stuck starting because they think it has to be this is what you write and this is how it's going to end up. And I don't remember where I learned to edit and revise and change, but I feel like, they get all the way through high school and they're still not really editing because they want it to be, they say what they want to say and they want that to be it. But I feel like that would be incredibly helpful for anybody who's trying to write.
Yeah, I was that way well into my 20s, like and through college. Like I put it down, that means it's perfect. The first thing I do when I talk to students now across, the elementary, high school, college, whatever, is I mention that the rewriting took longer than the writing for both these novels and for almost essentially every short story as well.
I had friends in college that used to either say, number one, a done paper is a good paper. Number two, write drunk, edit sober, which maybe is not the best idea, but it's like, spit it all out, then look at it. But, maybe not great advice, but, and not something you could pass on to your students, I'm sure.
Probably not, but maybe not the worst idea. Like you said, put it all down there first and then fix it.
Yeah. So, I think that's pretty much all of the questions I have for you at the moment. I don't want to take up more than an hour of your time. So I just want to say I'm so grateful for talking with you tonight and for your agreeing to talk with us. And it always adds such an extra dimension to any book discussion to be able to talk to its source. So
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, and thank you for your patience, for being flexible with my ridiculous airport
Easy.
situation. I appreciate it.
No big deal at all. And you've really created two pretty remarkable novels. So I would love to get my hands on the next one once it's ready, and I'll expect to hear from me.
All right, we'll see. We'll see. We'll check back in 5 or 6 years. We'll see.
I'm not giving you a timeline.
No, I really appreciate it. I can't believe you read both books. I hope you read something happy in between, but
I read American War in 2018.
Okay.
So I had some good long time between the two. And I do remember that discussion being really excellent as well. So you pack these books full of lots to talk about.
Thank you again for this. I hope we get to chat again one day.
Yes, I would love that. And safe travels and good luck with everything. And thank you again.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.